When you think about the time between the two world wars, what pops into your head? Probably stuff like jazz, flappers, the Great Depression, right? But what if I told you the whole picture of peace, it's mostly a mirage? What if, for 20 straight years, the fighting never really stopped? We're going to dig into how the war to end all wars actually did the exact opposite and set the stage for something way, way worse.
And this quote from historian Robert Gerworth, man, it just hits the nail on the head. He says peace was precarious, if not altogether illusionary. And he's right. The ceasefire in 1918, it didn't bring quiet. For millions of people, this so-called peace was just a cruel joke, a flimsy truce in a world that was still burning.
So how on earth did this all happen? Here's our roadmap. We'll start with that illusion of peace. Then we'll get into this new logic of violence that took hold. From there, we'll see how that led to the rise of some extreme, dangerous ideas, pushed the world to the brink. And finally, we'll look at the last few steps that tipped everyone into World War II.
All right, first up, the illusion of peace. Because that whole war to end all wars thing, yeah, it didn't really work out. Instead of peace, it shattered empires and kicked off this firestorm of new conflicts. And these new wars were in many ways even nastier and more chaotic than the one that had just ended. I mean, just look at the absolute chaos that erupted. It wasn't one big war anymore. It was dozens of smaller, vicious ones. You had new countries like Poland fighting bloody border wars. You had revolutions tearing places like Germany and Hungary apart. And you had these brutal civil wars like in Finland, where it was literally neighbor against neighbor. So yeah, the Great War might have ended on paper, but the fighting, it just spread out like a virus.
But here's the really crucial part. It wasn't just that they were fighting, it's how they were fighting. The whole nature of violence changed. This wasn't soldier on soldier in trenches anymore. No, this was messy. It was paramilitaries and militias fighting in the streets, and their targets were often civilians. This is where we see a really chilling phrase pop up: genocidal logic. The idea that you don't just beat your enemy, you wipe them off the map entirely. A truly dark sign of things to come. So this new way of fighting, focused on civilians, wasn't some kind of accident. It was a symptom of something much deeper. Which brings us to our next point, this new logic of violence. To really get how entire countries could embrace this kind of brutality, we've got to understand how a whole continent got traumatized by war. And here's the core concept. It's called brutalization theory. The idea is that 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter it broke European society. It made millions of people numb to death and made violence seem like a perfectly normal way to solve political problems. The trauma from the trenches didn't stay on the battlefield. It came home with the soldiers and poisoned everything. And you can break this brutalization down into 5 parts. First, people just got used to death. That made them way more willing to use violence themselves. Pretty soon, politics started to look like war, with uniformed thugs and street brawls. This created a toxic, you're either with us or against us mindset, where there's no room for compromise. And once you decide someone is your enemy, it's terrifyingly easy to start seeing them as less than human. And this is the devastating result. Like the historian Ernst Nolte said, the war basically created the perfect petri dish for the fascist bacillus to grow. In this new world of violence and hatred, an ideology like fascism didn't just find a foothold, it spread like a plague. Which leads us straight into our third section, the rise of extremes. Because in this atmosphere of fear, constant violence, and the collapse of the old world, that's fertile ground for some really radical ideas to take root. 3 huge forces were basically pouring gasoline on this fire. First, the Russian Revolution sparked this deep, paralyzing fear of communism spreading across Europe. Second, for countries that lost the war, like Germany, that feeling of humiliation became a powerful tool for whipping up nationalist anger. And third, when the old empires, like the Habsburgs, Ottomans, and Romanovs, crumbled, they left behind this chaotic mess of new borders and ethnic conflicts. It was the absolute perfect storm for extremism. And that fear of a Bolshevik contagion, it was absolutely weaponized. Anti-communist movements cynically blended it with centuries-old anti-Semitism to cook up this disgusting, deadly myth of Jewish Bolshevism. It was a powerful lie that let them justify horrific violence against 2 groups at the same time. Okay, now this is a super important distinction we need to make. On one side, you've got your classic right-wing authoritarianism. Think old-school dictators. Their main goal? Keep things the way they are, preserve the social order.
They're defensive. But fascism, that was something totally new. It was revolutionary. It didn't want to save the old world. It wanted to burn it down and build a brand new, aggressive, expansionist empire from the ashes. A huge difference.
And you saw this vicious cycle play out across Central Europe. First, a left-wing socialist group like the Spartacists in Berlin would try to take power. Then, in response, right-wing paramilitaries, angry, demobilized soldiers called the Freikorps, would come in and just crush them with unbelievable brutality. Every single revolution and counter-revolution just made more bloodshed seem normal.
So once these radical ideologies actually got into power, especially in Germany and Italy, they didn't just talk. They started actively tearing down the order that was set up after World War I. And that pushed the entire world right to the edge.
Nazi Germany's foreign policy had two terrifyingly simple goals. First, create a pan-German Reich by uniting all German speakers, which meant ripping up the Treaty of Versailles. Second, conquer Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, or living space. And let's be clear, that meant ethnic cleansing and enslavement to make room for German settlers.
Man, Hitler did not waste any time. Look at this. October 33, he's out of the League of Nations. March 35, he's openly rearming, building an air force, the Luftwaffe. By June, he's cut a deal with the British to build a bigger navy. And then, March 36, the big one, he marches troops right back into the Rhineland, a massive violation of the treaty. And with every single step, the world just kind of watched, which only encouraged him to push even harder. At the same time, you've got Mussolini's Italy invading Ethiopia. The sanctions from the League of Nations were a joke. They did nothing. But what they did do was push Mussolini away from Britain and France and straight into an alliance with Hitler. And just like that, the Rome-Berlin axis was born.
Then comes the Spanish Civil War, which was basically a terrifying sneak peek of World War II. You had the nationalists getting backed by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, who used it as a perfect chance to test out their new tanks and planes. You know, the Blitzkrieg. On the other side, the Republicans got support from the Soviet Union. And the democracies, Britain and France, they stayed out of it because they were terrified of starting a bigger war. In the end, it was a huge win for fascism and the perfect dress rehearsal for the main event.
Okay, so this brings us to the final act, because this crisis wasn't just in Europe. On the other side of the planet, another major power was also choosing aggression over peace, setting the stage for a conflict that would truly engulf the entire globe.
Japan, like every industrial nation, needed resources. Now, in the 1920s, their plan was to get them through trade and cooperation. But by the 1930s, the military was calling the shots, and they chose a much more violent path. Just go and conquer your neighbors to take what you need by force.
So why the huge change in strategy? Well, the Great Depression smashed Japan's economy. Their biggest export was silk, and when the U.S. stopped buying it, rural Japan was devastated. And where did the army get most of its soldiers? From those exact rural areas. So you ended up with an army full of angry, poor young men who saw conquest as the only way out.
And so, all these different threads finally come together. The brutalization of a continent, the rise of these violent ideologies, the total failure of the world to stop them, it all comes to a head on September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland, and this time, Britain and France finally draw the line. The Second World War in Europe had begun. So all of this leaves us with one last, pretty chilling question. When you look back at these 2 decades, at this non-stop chain of violence, the birth of ideologies that literally worshipped war, and the way peace just crumbled away, you really have to ask yourself, was a second, even more terrible world war always in the cards? Was it inevitable?